Hey everyone, time for another video. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the passively cooled GT710 from MSI. The GT710 was released in 2016 and was intended to compete with the integrated graphics and Intel CPUs, but just how does it fare today as a gaming card in 2018? This version packs 1GB of DDR3 memory rather than the usual GDDR5, so as you can expect it will be severely limited performance-wise due to this. It has a core clock of 954 MHz and a memory clock of 800 MHz, 1600 MHz effective, with a 64-bit bus width and a power consumption of around 19 watts, meaning you don't need any additional power connectors to run this card, although Nvidia do recommend at least a 300 watt power supply as they have to take into account the rest of the system as well. It officially supports up to DirectX 12, although I wouldn't expect it to be capable of playing any DirectX 12 games at playable frame rates. Output-wise, it supports HDMI and dual-link DVI. It also supports VGA output through a separate adapter that you can plug into the card, but I won't be using that in today's video. I can't remember how much I paid for this, but brand new, you can buy it for around £30 on overclockers.co.uk. Today I'll be testing it in 3D Mark and a few games as well to see what kind of performance it offers and if it is suitable for a real cheap PC build today. The system we'll be using today features an i7 6700K at 4.7 GHz to eliminate any CPU bottlenecking. 16GB of DDR4 RAM at 2800 MHz, and Windows 10 Pro 64-bit. So let's get started. First up, we're running the Firestrike benchmark in 3D Mark to see what kind of performance the GT710 can offer compared to the high-end cards of today. 3D Mark Firestrike is a test for both the CPU and the graphics card, but what we'll be looking at today is the graphics score that the 710 achieves. At the end of the run, an overall score of 710 was recorded with a graphics score of 745. To put that into perspective, my overclocked GTX 1080 in the same system achieves an overall score of 19,583, with a graphics score of 24,820, showing just how little power the GT710 offers. Overclocking wise, I managed to get the 710 stable at plus 400 on the core and plus 260 on the memory, and with the new clocks it achieved an overall score of 990 with a graphics score of 1049. A 41% increase in graphics score. First up for our games today is The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, based on novels by the Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski, released on 19th of May 2015 for PC, PS4 and Xbox One, and is a massive open world game in which you control the main character, Geralt of Rivia, on a quest to save his adoptive daughter Ciri from the Wild Hunt. We'll be testing the GT710 at 1080p and 720p for both stock and overclocked frequencies at the lowest settings we can. At 1080p with no overclock, the game is so far beyond being playable that I didn't even bother running a Fraps benchmark due to the issues. The FPS rarely, if ever at all, reached over 7, with the 710's usage pinned at 100% and the 6700K's usage around 7% at best. The FPS wasn't the worst of the issues though, as the major input lag I experienced trumped that in terms of how much it affected the gameplay, with camera movements lagging behind the mouse by over half a second, making precise movement and even going in a straight line a massive challenge. It got a bit better at 720p, but unfortunately was still unplayable with some input lag. Admittedly not anywhere near as much as 1080p, but enough to make it uncomfortable to play. The FPS fared a bit better, and after a 15-minute Fraps benchmark, it achieved an average of 12 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 9 and 4 frames per second respectively. Overclocking didn't really improve it much either, with plus 380 on the core and plus 160 on the memory, the highest I could get stable. 1080p was still a no-go, with the same issues as the stock clocks, although the FPS did hit a staggering 10 at some point. Overclock performance at 720p fared a lot better than 1080p, with FPS ranging between 13 to 17 frames per second, although the gameplay was still quite jarring, which a 15-minute Fraps benchmark showed, with an average of 15 frames per second and 1% and 0.1% lows of 12 and 7 FPS respectively. Next up is Fortnite Battle Royale, the free-to-play and one of the most popular games out right now. Initially released as an early access game for Windows, macOS, PS4 and Xbox One in September 2017, it features a 100-player battle to the death, with the last player standing declared the winner. At 1080p on the lowest settings with stock clocks, the 710 didn't do too well, but was still kind of playable. The FPS in the pre-match holding area was around 15, but on the ground during the match it ranged between 20 to 25, which made combat a bit tough at times, but definitely still doable. The game did exhibit some texture popping issues, although I'm sure that was just the low graphical settings causing that. A 15-minute Fraps benchmark showed an average of 24 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 13 and 10 frames per second respectively, showing that the game on occasion did stutter. Moving on to 720p, and the 710 performs reasonably well. So well in fact that I was able to run the game at medium settings with post-processing on low. With this configuration, the game didn't show any noticeable stutter or input lag, and I found myself actually enjoying it. The 710 managed around 25 to 30 frames per second on the ground, but achieved higher than that depending on the area of the map you were in, which a 15-minute Fraps benchmark shows, with an average of 34 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 18 and 16 frames per second respectively. Overclocked performance-wise though, the 710 showed a reasonable improvement, with plus 400 on the core and plus 250 on the memory being stable. The 710 managed performance bordering on being playable, with only minor occasional stutter and no input lag at 1080p on the lowest settings. FPS in the pre-match holding area ranged between 23 to 28 frames per second. On the ground, the FPS tended to be between the low 20s up to the low 30s. A 15-minute Fraps benchmark showed an average of 30 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 16 and 10 frames per second respectively. Moving to 720p, and again this is the resolution you really should be using on the 710, and the overclock made a massive difference to the game, with over 40 frames per second in the pre-match holding area and over 40 to 50 frames per second on the ground during a match. Like previously, there was no input lag, but also no stutter like experienced at 1080p, which the Fraps benchmark shows with an average of 50 frames per second, and 1% and 0.1% lows of 35 and 15 frames per second respectively, showing the 710 to be a fantastic card for this game at 720p with reasonable detail settings. Lastly for our games today is Grand Theft Auto 5. GTA 5 released on 17th September 2013 for Xbox 360 and PS3, with Xbox One and PS4 releases coming on 18th of November 2014, and the PC release finally happening on 14th of April 2015. At 1080p at the lowest settings possible with soft shadows, the game still complained about the memory usage exceeding the 1GB the GT 710 has to offer. Out in the desert area, the 710 managed between 15 to 20 frames per second, depending on what area you're in. But during the test I also noticed some input lag and stutter throughout gameplay, which did make precision driving quite tough at times. The game also had moments where the inputs would lock up completely for a couple of seconds, making for some quite hilarious gameplay if you happen to be trying to turn a corner for example. A 15-minute Fraps benchmark showed an average of 24 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 14 and 12 frames per second respectively. At 720p, with the lowest settings and soft shadows, the 710 fared better, with FPS ranging between 30 to 40 again, depending on what area you're in the desert. Unlike at 1080p, there was no input lag or stutter, and thankfully no input lockups either, and it was definitely playable at this resolution. A 15-minute Fraps benchmark showed an average of 33 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 24 and 21 frames per second respectively, showing the occasional but not particularly noticeable stutter. With overclocking, I had to drop to plus 380 on the core and plus 160 on the memory again due to instability at higher clocks, and at 1080p the game still didn't perform fantastically. FPS in the desert ranged between 20 to 35 frames per second depending on what area you're in, and the game still exhibited the same stutter, input lag and input locking issues as stock clocks. A Fraps benchmark showed an average of 28 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 16 and 12 frames per second respectively. At 720p with the overclock, the game was quite enjoyable. It achieved around 40 to 50 frames per second out in the desert, with no input lag, stutter or input locking to speak of, and maintained over 30 frames per second in other areas of the game for the most part. The Fraps benchmark showed an average of 42 frames per second, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 30 and 21 frames per second respectively, showing the game to be relatively stutter-free at 720p. I also tested Rise of the Tomb Raider, but unfortunately I can't include it because it makes the video far too long. But at 1080p the game was completely unplayable, and at 720p with an overclock the FPS was still under 20. Overall though, the 710 performed a lot better than I was expecting, at least at 720p. As at 1080p, with the games I tested, the performance was pretty abysmal with all of them, other than maybe Fortnite. The card is most definitely a no-go for games like The Witcher 3, Rise of the Tomb Raider and GTA 5 at 1080p, but with an overclock can provide reasonable performance at 720p, with low settings in Grand Theft Auto 5, and with medium settings in Fortnite. Personally, I wouldn't recommend it to anyone planning on gaming though, but I would say it makes a decent display adapter for motherboards that don't have an HDMI output. If you liked this video, please consider liking and sharing it and subscribing to my channel for more content like this. Hopefully you tune in for the next one.